In this paper, which again I can give you a reference to, these are the character virtues that are regarded as important in disaster management. It's not all-inclusive. There are some that may not be there. You may recognise some of these, but I want you to pay particular attention to three as we go through this today. The virtue of prudence. The idea that people have to be wise, they have to be shrewd, they have to understand the context in which they work. You have to exercise good judgment. Stewardship. That's responsible planning and management of resources that you have to hand, but also of yourself. How thinly are you spread over time, over all the activities that you participate in? The final part of my presentation this morning, I'm going to be talking about a study that we've done with mental health professionals, looking at their experience of assisting during recovery. What's it like going through a recovery with a population who's been badly affected by it when you're part of that community too? And communication. It's great to be doing all this activity, but how do you communicate with others? How do you communicate to your publics? Not just one public, you have several publics. You have several groups of stakeholders who you are trying to serve. You have your clinical community, you have your research community, you have the wider community, you have your public stakeholders, government, funders, all these different publics that you're trying to serve and communicate with. How do you do that? How do you do that in a cost-efficient, time-efficient, resource-efficient way? Okay, I want you to be thinking about that too. In Tom Rainer's presentation first off, we talked about the 4Rs model: risk reduction and readiness, response and recovery. So what I'm going to be talking about today is that roughly split into three parts: before, during and after. Again, with the ideas of prudence, stewardship and communication in mind. So let's start with before. Just to recap some of the things that you already know. Some of the disaster mental health effects that you will see depend upon roughly these three different characteristics, these three facets of the Rubik's Cube of disaster impact. First one is we've talked about in some of the other workshop sessions, the type of the disaster. Is it a natural hazard that's turned into a disaster for the affected population? Is it a technological type of disaster? So maybe perhaps there's been a train derailment, or an aircraft disaster, or was that malicious? Or is there a suspicion that it was malicious? Okay, so we know, for example, if it was arson in a bushfire, if there is a suspicion that it was deliberately lit, that someone has done this deliberately with some kind of malicious intent, it takes that community at least double the time to come to terms with that. Exposure. Was there a warning? So for something like a typhoon, you can see it kind of generate, but if you look at Patricia recently on the Mexican coast where it hit, that developed very, very quickly. That was a real surprise for people. So climate change is already having an impact upon, suspected impact upon what kinds of warnings that we're going to get for what we traditionally thought were long lead-in time events. The intensity, your proximity to it, so not just your geographical proximity, but we know that people who are only 1 or 2 degrees removed from the community of impact still feel the ripples of post-traumatic stress risk. The duration of the event, and as I've said before, the intent. What is the perceived intent of this? People can say, I've done something wrong, this is an act of God, this is some kind of punishment. That is often a belief that people may have, and they want to kind of right that wrong before things can progress onwards. And Douglas spoke very eloquently about this idea of risk, this ecological view that we need to take. It's not just the intrapersonal factors, but it is how we sit within our communities and the wider resources within those communities. So governance structures, schools, community centres, community movements, all of these are important risk and resilience factors within how people react and respond to disasters. So I want to just make sure that we understand the importance of the DRR framework. And are people familiar with the Hyogo framework for action? Do you know what that was it is? Would anybody like to volunteer a quick explanation? So this was a framework that was in place globally signed off by the UN General Assembly between 2005 and 2015 around activities that should be in place for disaster risk reduction. Martin and I were talking about this. How many times was the health sector mentioned in this document?
Around 4 times.
Around 4 times, yeah?
Around 4 times you mentioned health along it.
Yeah. So there's been a massive process around negotiating a new framework for action, 2015 to 2030. This is to take place. The Sendai Framework for Action, which was agreed in Japan earlier on this year. How many times is the health sector being mentioned in this fund?
Around 40 times.
40 times. Huge win for the health sector in order that we get global recognition of the importance of the health sector and health activity for disaster risk reduction. But with that recognition comes responsibility. Okay? If your nation is part of the UN General Assembly, your nation has ratified this document. Okay? You now have leverage in your countries to say, we are bound by this, we should be undertaking activity to deliver upon this framework. But you also need to be aware and exercise that prudence around the political rhythm of how these decisions are made and the financial rhythm of the resourcing around these decisions. Okay, so you need to be really quite smart about thinking about when are the meetings taking place in your country? What are the ways that you can feed into that decision-making process? Say for in New Zealand, we're now on the Security Council. There was a big push around Sendai to get this done. Once the agreement was done, nobody's interested. You try to get any kind of like traction to talk about Sendai now, the window has closed. We're probably going to be waiting for another 2 years before there's some kind of global check-in process around, well, how are you doing with Sendai? And then there'll be a whole load of flurrying activity around that. So my job is to prepare for the next window. Identify the next window, get people ready to make some kind of representation so that the voice is heard. So what does this specifically say? You'll get this, you don't have to write this down, okay? Specifically in this section 30, enhance the resilience of national health systems, including integrating disaster risk management into primary, secondary and tertiary healthcare, especially at the local level. So there's a recognition that it's not just a national system, it has to be reflected locally. Developing the capacity of health workers in understanding disaster risk and applying and implementing DRR approaches in health work. It's not enough for just the top level or management of the health system to be knowledgeable about this. It's right down to the health workers. Promoting and enhancing training capacities, and also this DRR approaches in health programs in collaboration with other sectors. So it's not just health alone, it's the whole of the government sector. Specifically for you, Priority 4 and Section 33, enhance recovery schemes to provide psychosocial support and mental health services for all people in need. So having good needs assessment processes in place and to have the capacity and capability to deliver psychosocial support where it is needed. Okay, you now have a global mandate to do this work, if your local mandate wasn't enough. So let's just recap, what do we mean by psychosocial support? We talked about this before, right? They reckon that around about 80% of people who go through disaster situations don't need any intervention, formal intervention. They can call upon their own resources, either interpersonal, their family or their wider community structures, in order to adjust to that situation. We're trying to improve social ecology. Essentially, we're trying to focus upon the network of relationships linking individuals to each other within and between communities. What we can often see, if you look at Rob Gordon's work in Australia, is that we can see that we have fractures that occur within and between communities. And then suddenly it becomes this battle for resource between some communities that feel favoured and some communities who do not. Okay, so part of our role is to try to heal that, spot that, heal that, or at least process that when that's coming up. And considering culture and values by being mindful of the value and meaning given to behaviour and experience as reflected by individuals and communities. Not going in with assumptions as to what a particular story means. So Marvel, you talked about yesterday in your poster presentation how these myths are not always unhelpful. They can actually be protective sometimes to make sure that the social fabric, the social capital is maintained in this time of stress. Okay, so really thinking about what does this story mean that I'm hearing? What's the benefit? Who benefits from that? So in New Zealand, we had these principles of psychosocial recovery. This is my entry into disaster management work. Before this, I was a clinical psychologist working in a physiotherapy department in a hospital in New Plymouth. I decided I wanted to leave that job, so I took a 6-month role developing this massive pile of documents into a short, readable document. And I've not been able to leave disaster management since then. This has been 10 years now almost that I've been doing this. So in that, very briefly, the principles that we outlined, there's a relationship between the psychosocial element of recovery and other elements of recovery. Okay? As the built environment recovers, as the natural environment recovers, so the people recover. If the built environment cannot recover, the natural environment cannot recover, the recovery of the people is delayed. They're affected by that. They're intertwined. You cannot separate them. So although you see a lot of resource going into the built environment, yes, that will bring the people up to a certain extent, but not all of them. You know, inequalities come with that. And that's why one of those principal virtues, if you remember at the beginning, was justice. We have a strong sense of social inequity, and we are sensitized to when that occurs. We see that. Okay, so we need to keep that in mind. Self-help to more intensive forms of support should be operationalised through a well-supported triage process, immediately post-event and onwards. Okay, so you have a good assessment system. For some people, all they need is to be pointed to the right information or the right community linkages such that they can support themselves and make sense of their experience. We were speaking in one of the groups where people were saying that actually they kind of need their experiences normalised. Right? This is actually quite common for people, and that's enough. Knowing that they're not alone in going through this experience is enough. Often you'll find that when you do research actually has an impact upon those people who participate in that research. That's another place where you can be effective. So in New Zealand, this looks like this. Okay, so at the bottom, you have this idea of basic services and security. At the next tier up, we have these community and family supports, and these are some of the services that are involved in that. We have the focused, non-specialised supports at the kind of primary healthcare physician level. So you're looking at general practitioners or associated health workers operating at that level. Then only at the top tier, these specialised services, which are around about 5 to 15% of the population will need those services. That's where you have the specialist psychiatric or psychological services for the more severely affected. Okay? You don't wait to get these services up and running. Some people will go straight in at tier 4 if they have had particularly problematic lives, if they have risk factors to have elevated symptomology. Some people will perhaps need these more basic services, but unless they're in place, the risk is that they move up the pyramid. What we found in New Zealand is that a lot of people said, you know what, I don't need the help right now. You can go and help other people. We're now starting to see those people in years 3, 4, and 5 start presenting as specialised services because they've left it so long that their problems have become entrenched. So they have all these symptoms that now they see as kind of normal, but it now gets in the way of them operating their regular lives. Okay, so you need to be making sure that you're going in and checking the needs of the community at regular intervals. We had an interesting discussion yesterday, but it's certainly in New Zealand, and I would encourage you to think about this quite carefully. When you have outreach or screening or intervention programs for trauma or related problems, just because it happens in a disaster situation does not mean you drop your ethical standards. Yeah, so if your research programs or clinical interventions are taking place in disaster scenarios, they should not be put in place unless you have good governance structures around that. Because what you will do is you will breach trust. And if you breach trust, it's very, very hard to get it back. It takes ages to build that trust. It only takes one incident, widely publicised in the media, for it to be broken. We were just having a conversation around the importance of trust and reputation with Abby on the way here today. That, I can't understate that. Operational effectiveness in psychosocial recovery from emergency events stems from effective readiness phase actions. You need to be doing it now while the disaster is not occurring. It's too late to be doing it when the disaster is underway. You need to be doing all of that work now. And that means not just within the health sector, but across all parts of the disaster management system. So it may be that you need to form those relationships now. If you get a phone call in the middle of the night, you're much more likely to answer it and do something if you know the person at the end of the phone. If you're getting a stranger at the end of the phone, you're having to do all this kind of getting to know each other, figuring out what their role is, what your role is, when there's work to be done. So you need to sort that out first. I'm doing okay for time, so I can move to during. I'm going to talk about the New Zealand context, and again, the experience that I know best is the Christchurch and Canterbury earthquake. So hopefully you'll be able to learn something and take something from this and apply it to your own situation. That's what I'm hoping you're going to be able to do. So New Zealand is not part of Australia. It's a different country. I didn't mean that at all. No.
Yes, probably known as the West Island.
Yes. Douglas actually worked at Massey University before I got there, so we know each other reasonably well. And it's lovely to be able to be with him now, even though he's in Australia. So it's a small country with a small population, but a complex hazard profile. Okay, so we're subject to, we're called the Shaky Isles for a reason. We have earthquakes all the time. We have storms all the time. We have severe weather a lot of the time. We have only 4.4 million people. We have one of the largest diasporas in terms of percentage of population of any country. You will see a New Zealander pretty much everywhere you go. You'll meet them. If I've lived in New Zealand for 10 years now. I was saying to her beforehand, if I bump into a New Zealander overseas, I probably know someone that they know. Reputation is really important, right? And you'll know that from your own kind of local context as well. Within your region, you'll be known. It's really important to guard that. So the largest population centres are on the North Island, except for Christchurch, which is the largest city on the South Island, which is just here. That's where Christchurch is here. We have the biggest fault is the Transalpine fault, which goes across here. If that goes, it's predicted to be a magnitude 8, possibly larger earthquake, which will have a severe impact upon New Zealand life. So in September 2010, we had the first in a series of earthquakes. That was actually the larger earthquake. This just shows you the fault I was just talking about here. In February 2011, we had the major loss of life earthquake, where 185 people died, and with extensive repeated liquefaction, so people's houses got this bubbling kind of smelling mud-like substance into their house time and time again. So in September 2010, there was no loss of life happened in the middle of the night. So people thought that they got off relatively lightly, and to a certain extent, perhaps could be argued that there was some complacency. Now, this was an unexpected earthquake, although if you look at indigenous knowledge, there was definitely knowledge that this was a risky area. If you look at the old maps of Christchurch, it was basically built on a drained swamp. And we knew that there was seismic activity under there, but there hadn't been any for a while. But perhaps one of the reasons that we fell into that sense of complacency was that we mistook low risk for no risk. If you look at the global hazard map, every bit of New Zealand is high risk compared to other regions of the world. So it's interesting, right? Relative risk, it's that kind of frog in the boiling water, okay? The frog doesn't know that it's in the warm water and the water's heating up if you don't look outside in the world and compare your temperature to what's happening in the rest of the world. This is followed by a 6.3 magnitude earthquake in February 2011. It's a lower magnitude earthquake, but far more damaging just because of the way the fault was angled. The fault slipped and it was directed right under the CBD of the city, and it slipped upwards. And it was some of the fastest vertical acceleration of an earthquake that's ever been measured. Partly because we have a lot of sensors in New Zealand in order to be able to measure that. But I'll give you an idea as to what that looked like. That's just a rough distribution map, and you can see here was the original epicenter of the earthquake in Darfield. So it wasn't actually in main Christchurch, but it was a substantial, for New Zealand, population area. And then we have the 6.3 shock here. It's classed as an aftershock, but actually it looks like it was possibly a different fault, most likely a different fault, which has its own aftershock sequence. So you have two earthquakes with their own aftershock sequences, and then another two after that in June 2011, and then in December 2011 after that. These were substantial aftershocks. And one of the reasons why it's important to note this is that a lot of the insurance firms delayed paying out because this insurance sequence, as far as they were concerned, was still ongoing. So there were a lot of people with damaged houses who were prioritised to work but couldn't even get assessments in because they said, we're going to wait until this is over. That was never explicitly said, but their actions spoke louder than words. We'll talk about the impact of secondary stresses later on. So you can see from this one here, the 2011 Tohoku earthquake and tsunami, 2.7 G-force, single direction on that left-hand column. The one in February 2011, 2.2 G-force, second highest recorded after Tohoku, which happened at that point. It was the largest. Tohoku happened a month later. So it's a significant jolt, vertical jolt, and people report feeling, and there were videos of roofs actually lifting off houses and then falling back down again. Okay, so it's a pretty scary experience for them. If we compare that to Nepal, we see this fault rupture in Nepal, 7.8, but the peak gravity acceleration was 0.6, so less vertical shock. But you've got a quake that's 250 times larger than happened in Christchurch. Okay, 76 million people exposed to ground shaking, strong ground shaking in Nepal, 435,000 in Christchurch. But if you look at violent ground shaking, a different class, then you look at, actually it's higher in Christchurch. And you've got bigger potential terror impacts because of that. Okay, so it's an important earthquake from that point of view. And what happened was you had a big self-evacuation out of the area. Maybe up to 20,000 people at last estimate, which is probably the largest internal migration since the 1930s and 40s in New Zealand. And with that, great uncertainty. If you look at the size of the nation compared to the Japan GDP, it's probably going to cost Japan around about 3% of their GDP. It's probably going to cost us more like 10% of our GDP. So substantial economic impact, not just for the region, but for the whole country. The whole country carries and underwrites the cost of this. Okay, so small country, large consequences. So when we're thinking as mental health professionals, we're thinking not just the immediate impact, but what is the risk carried forward now? What is going to be the impact upon health services? What are people going to be thinking about in terms of disaster risk reduction, capacity and capability building in order to meet similar challenges in other areas in New Zealand? So we know that homes are affected, our sense of safety, our sense of security, our sense of refuge, our sense of togetherness. So people come together in family homes. If your family home is no longer operating, where do people meet? I remember reading and experiencing whenever I would go to Christchurch. I live in Wellington. So again, just a slight aside, I have a very strange position in that I'm familiar with what is going on in Christchurch and Canterbury, but I live in a different place. Now for me, that felt like a real disadvantage at the very beginning because I felt somehow disconnected. But as I've progressed through the recovery, I've seen that as a real advantage. I'm familiar enough to know what's going on, and I'm known by the community and I'm known by the officials there, but I can stand far enough away to give them frank feedback and to be able to say, do you know what, I'm seeing this. I'm not sure what your experience is like, but I'm seeing this from here. So I'm able to offer that distance, which at the beginning felt like a disadvantage, but as we've gone on has felt like a distinct advantage. Work. We've been here together for what, 13 hours on the first day? 12 hours again yesterday? Substantial hours again today. Work takes a big portion of our lives. Abby and I were talking today about how much time we spend working, right? And how we try to manage that in our lives. When work is taken away from people because their work premises are damaged, don't underestimate how much of a big impact that is for people. Okay? It gives them a sense of purpose. If people have work in their lives, it gives them a reason to be getting up in the morning. For many of them, you take that away, it's difficult. And for yourselves too, you get a great deal of satisfaction from your work. When you're not able to work, how does that feel? How long does it take you to relax when you go on holiday?
For me, straight away.
Straight away, easy. You're good at it. Excellent. It takes me a good week or so to switch down and to calm my mind down to be able to go on holiday. So work takes us over sometimes. And play and rest, okay? So one of the things that we've understood, I think, more in Christchurch and Canterbury as we've gone on is that existing is different from living. to fully participate in life and have all of your community assets in place, your community relationships in place, is different to existing. So one of the things that I think that we pay great attention to is if you look at the things that people miss in disasters, in the top 10 is access to community space and the access to be able to mix and work with and to recreate with other people. Okay, we underestimate the impact and the influence of in life satisfaction for people of that. We know this. Just to recap, the responses we might see. If we're forewarned, we're much more likely to see this anticipation, this anxiety, but on the plus side, we're more likely to see planning. If it's unexpected, we're much more likely to see shock, fear, uncertainty, but also confusion as well, and it differs according to man-made or terrorist events. But we know that there's a greater degree of disturbance if there's a change in the entire physical and organisational structure of a community, if the impact consists of more than the impact of the physical event and persists for a long period of time, and if there are additional subsequent impacts and disruptions that require further coping. If your disaster and the one that you're trying to meet the challenge of, meets these three criteria, you're in for a longer haul, and you're likely to see a greater degree of disturbance. Familiar with this graph, this picture of people? So what we tend to see is this warning and impact. You see this kind of adaptational response, and you sometimes see this honeymoon period immediately after the impact. You see this community coming together, much of aid coming in, foreign assistance, all sorts of things pouring into the country. And then what you tend to see is this tailing off. Other events tend to take over, or bureaucracy takes over. Yes, the aid is there, but it's the wrong kind of aid. Who wants second-hand clothes from the West with oversized people when actually what we want is money? We need money to buy food and resources, local food and resources, not stuff that's shipped in from overseas that people don't like or are not familiar with or can't prepare. Okay, what we want is tatami mats, for the Japanese to make them feel like they are in a place that they're familiar with. And tatami mats also mark out space. Okay, this is my own private space. What we tend to see is this area of disillusionment, where actually community functioning goes below the previous level equilibrium. Now what we're starting to discover, I think, is that this dip goes on a lot longer in Christchurch, and it goes through lots more ups and downs than this nice smooth graph going up to enhanced community and individual adaptation. I'm not sure what your view is on that, but I'll invite you to discuss that with me later, but certainly in the workshop afterwards. What are the likely things that you might see in your communities during recovery? So there is this popular idea now in Christchurch that we see the four tribes of Christchurch. We have the hopeful, the untouched, the disillusioned, and the angry. Okay, the untouched were those people who perhaps lived in the north and the west suburbs of Christchurch, where they knew an earthquake happened, but it didn't affect their property. They don't work in any other area of Christchurch. They pretty much stick to their suburbs. So yeah, theoretically there was an earthquake, and it kind of disturbed them and it scared them for a few weeks, but nothing really has happened after that. We have the hopeful. We have those people who see action taking place in their community. They're lucky enough to have lived in suburbs where resources have been put in. Okay, they think that things are going to get better. And then we have the disillusioned. We have the perhaps socially deprived areas which weren't working so well beforehand or had challenges beforehand, and they've seen massive damage and very, very slow to have resources or supports put in. And we have the angry. We have those people who have this disillusionment, and have reacted with it with much more arousal, much more anger at how they feel that their contract of trust with the government and with insurance companies has been broken. My deal is that I pay you a premium. I pay you a premium and you carry my risk. The risk has been realised and you have not paid out, and you don't look like you're going to pay out. And the government is not doing anything about it as far as I'm concerned. So I'm very, very angry, which delays recovery, which has massive community reverberation. Think about how that looks in your community. What does the word resilience mean to those that hear that message? When people are told that they should be more resilient, how do you think that makes them feel?
Should I?
Sorry?
Should I have the resilience? I mean, I'm in shock now. Should I have it?
Somehow you're seen as lacking, right? It's like it's your fault. You're not more resilient. That was certainly the reaction that we got. There's a real pushback against this idea of resilience. So it actually became a word that I did not mention for a good year, because the reaction that you get from that word means that anything else you say is not heard, because you're just another resilience expert who's come into this situation. So be careful about language and how it's perceived, right? Resilience is a word that we throw around technically, but actually for communities, it may not be that word, it may be other words, but be sensitive around that, the meaning of those words. We have this truncation of time versus strategic information processing. What I mean by that is that in order to process information and use it strategically, you need your frontal cortex working. If your frontal cortex is not working because of fear or because of worry about how you're going to feed your family, if your limbic system is activated and you don't have a lot of time to be spending on processing information, it doesn't matter how much information you give people, they're not going to process it. They're not going to hear it. So often in disaster risk management, the problem has been that people will go, look, we've given them the information, but they're not doing anything about it. It's their own fault. Okay, think about whether information is actually what's needed by people in those periods of time. Actually, what we should be doing is promoting calm, so people are able to use those parts of their systems internally and within their communities to hear and understand their risk and to act upon it. I'm just going to move through a few slides now. So what I found is that my role has changed, and my role is multiple. And I'm just going through a few here now, and I invite you to think about yours later on. I have a tactical role. So I act as a clinical advisor. One of the biggest things that I do, which is invisible, right? It's not written up. It's not a paper. I've not written a paper. I should write a paper about it. But it's actually preventing harm. It's preventing stupid things from being done and silly things by well-meaning people who want to do something, or they have a political imperative to do something. They want to do something, but it's actually telling them, don't put your resources in that, put it in this instead. You're giving them options. One of my failures that I see is that I was not able to prevent counsellors from other places being put in to the response in the initial period because they felt like they had to do something and the counsellors locally were swamped. It was a political decision. I was actually working on my kitchen table in London at the time, and it was the middle of the night, and I couldn't do anything about it. And I had to give a very, very careful radio interview so as to not to annoy people. But you will have wins and losses around that, and people feel like they need to do something. But the other thing that you can do is to offer supervision and mentoring for those clinicians or those researchers who are working in affected areas. So even though you're not contributing directly, you are supporting those people who are working directly. I have a strategic role. I contribute as one input into evidence-informed policy. Okay? There is a difference between evidence-informed policy and evidence-based policy. I actually think it's quite arrogant for us as researchers or as scientists to say that we provide the evidence and it is your duty to act upon it. We are but one input into that system. There is all kinds of trade-offs that are going on that we perhaps don't understand, but we need to understand. We need to be more cognizant of that. I was lucky enough to work as a private secretary to one of the ministers in the UK government just before these earthquakes were happening. It was a real eye-opener to me in terms of how the Secretariat protect and channel information that gets to a minister, the ultimate decision maker. So you need to know more about that system around the Secretariat that surrounds the decision makers. Get to know those people, understand, build relationships with those people. Once you're starting to have conversations with them and you're providing them options for solutions, not just a description of the problem or one option, you need to come with a portfolio of solutions. So I have an advisory role with the Canterbury Earthquake Recovery Authority, which is a special government department that was set up locally. I have a few others as well. But I also have a really interesting media role as well. So I have gone out and I've cultivated relationships with reporters who I thought were good. So actually I think that you write fair write-ups. They're not one-sided, they're not sensationalist. I'm actually going to try and have a relationship with you such that when there is a story about a disaster, then you can feel free to call me. And if I can't talk about it, that's fine, I'll pass. If I can, I will. I'll give you something meaningful that you can use. I was also in a very strange position where I was asked to broker a relationship between the media organisation in town and the government agency in town where their relationship had broken down. So it's really offering free and frank advice to the media organisation as to what they were doing poorly, but what they were doing well, and what they could do to increase the amount of stuff that they were doing well. But also free and frank advice to the government agency around their comms strategy and their communications work and what it is that they weren't doing so well and what it is that they could do better. So always thinking about what they could do better. You know this. Leave people with actionable stuff that they can do that is positive. So leadership role, we've been very lucky. We've managed to be the group that has rewritten the National Health Emergency Plan for New Zealand. It was our group that did that, and that got published last month. That's incredibly valuable opportunity for us. But that was all built upon 8 years of trusted relationship, that we were given the opportunity in a tender process, and we were chosen to do that. And we're about to rewrite the National Psychosocial Support Advice document. We're just in the final stages of negotiation of that, fingers crossed. I have a research role, which